Okay, I think we can probably make a start. I know one or two people have had to jump off to catch trains, so slightly thinner room, but not too bad. That's pretty good. So we're going to turn now in the penultimate session to another extremely important issue as it goes. Perhaps one of the most important obligations that an organisation is under, and an obligation which people who run organisations are under, and that is the safety and welfare of those who come into contact with an organisation. I think we can probably all name, without trying too hard, examples in the media or elsewhere, perhaps in our own experience, of behaviour that falls short of where it should be, sometimes way below the standard that it should be. A number of these have resulted in reports, publicity, media coverage, which is only part of the negative problem. There's, of course, the negative problem of what is happening in the first place. Our next panel is going to discuss some of the learnings that we can draw from those reports and how organisations, people leading and working in organisations can go about ensuring that safety and welfare can be cascaded, in keeping with the theme of today, can be cascaded throughout an organisation. So I'm going to hand you over to our next panel, which is going to be moderated by Jane Molyneux, Director of Children and Young People at Sport England. She's going to be joined by Katie Fudakowski, a barrister and partner at Farrer & Co., and Savita Sohal, case manager from Sports Resolutions. So, Jane, it's all yours.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you, everybody. 9:15 seems like such a long time ago. And I'm sat here thinking, have those lights always been on, or is it because it's starting to go dark outside? Anyway, so thank you. I know some people had to leave, but thank you for those who are sticking with us for today. I mean, some of the things we're going to talk on, there's a thread running all the way through today's session. Obviously, if you're still with us online, again, thank you for joining us this session. So what I'm probably going to do, and I promise I'm going to stick to time because I know people want to finish at 20 to 5 because you'll have trains to get. So we're going to cut this session short slightly. But what we're going to focus on is around strengthening governance, welfare and safety. So probably for the next 20-25 minutes, the three of us, you'll have probably noticed that unfortunately John Donnelly from UK Sport wasn't able to make it with us today. So the three of us are going to have a discussion, as Craig said, talking about some of the themes that have come out of the recent reviews. So recently the White review into British gymnastics. Obviously Chris Quinlan, QC or Casey now, did a review into UK athletics. More recently, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse reported last week or the week before. If time, we will allow some questions, because I'm sure you've got lots of questions, but equally, if we do run out of time, Craig, I'm really happy if delegates want to feed it to you, and then between the three of us, we can coordinate the questions to come back to you. So I was going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, but Craig, you've brilliantly done it, which means we can sort of skip back into it. But as I introduced and we have the discussions, obviously Katie and Savita, if there's anything you want to add about the work you've done, please do so. But what I'm just going to do for sort of 5 minutes is sort of set the scene. And hopefully you've all read the description of the session, and you would absolutely agree with the statement that a key responsibility for all organisations at any level is the provision of a safe environment for everybody to enjoy sport. And you'll have heard some of my colleagues talk about our strategy Uniting the Movement, and hopefully this is features in all of your strategies, is that we want to create positive experiences for children and young people. Enjoyment, we know from our Active Lives Children and Young People survey, is the biggest driver for participation. So we want to make sure that any environment that we create is safe and inclusive. And obviously, again, with our strategy, is an increase focused on governance, safeguarding and integrity. But unfortunately, obviously, recent cases have drawn that into question. And we know that, unfortunately, there are some people out there that don't have positive experiences. I mean, I was interested, obviously, in, I wrote this down, obviously, Spencer talked about the survey that he did as part of workforce governance. That, as in 17% or 344, parents had said that their children had experienced some form of issue, and obviously 4.1 of those, it had been serious enough for them to have reported to statutory services. So there's some fantastic work going out there, but there's clearly more that we can do to have positive experiences. So of course there's high profile cases, but I can guarantee every one of you in this room, no matter what level you're working at, will have experienced some form of incident that makes you look at the integrity, the safeguarding and the welfare of your participants. And it's interesting, so I went to, British Gymnastics did a Safe Sports Symposium about 3 weeks ago as part of the World Gymnastics Championships in Liverpool. Great opening session from somebody from their international federation who used the analogy of Apollo 13. You think, well, what's that got to do with safeguarding and integrity? And it was about the astronauts that were in the rocket, obviously shooting for the moon, and they were sort of on their target, that's the way we're going. But the first time, as they were going towards space, the Earth came into view and they looked down. And what she challenged everybody in the room is that, yes, you may be shooting for targets, whether that's medals, whether that's getting more people taking part, but please look back at yourselves and organisations and what you are doing. So look back at yourself. Look at what can we do, what lessons can we learn all the time from everything that's happening. So it's just the astronauts look back at the world and go, do we really look back on ourselves? So that is an interesting analogy, and I challenge each of you with that. So again, there's lots of areas that we could focus on. We're probably going to do 3 or 4, and the first one, you've heard it talked about lots today, is around culture, compliance to culture, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But we're going to specifically look at values. And obviously, John, as in, we had a pre-panel discussion, he was really, really passionate about the values of an organisation. So I'm going to introduce, obviously, in terms of the panel, as in Katie, Savita, as in, what do you think that's really key about organisations' culture or values in the work that you do? So, Katie, do you maybe want to kick off?
Yeah, of course. It's probably helpful if I sort of frame what I'm going to say by telling you that I'm a lawyer. Sorry about that. And I work in a law firm. We have a safeguarding unit, and we act for sports organisations, NGBs, GBs, and other clients like schools, education, businesses, charities, etc. And we sort of try and cross-fertilise the learning across those different sectors. But the primary purpose is safeguarding children or adults at risk. And I think your values question, Jane, is like totally central to what we try to do in the SU. And to maybe give a kind of really concrete example of why we think organisations getting to grips with what their values or their culture are and is in the context of low-level concerns, which we've written quite extensively about and have produced some guidance. Because we worked with an academic on that, Marcus Aruga. He's got some really fascinating research about behaviour of people who abuse children. And there's a sort of erroneous perception among people that you can sort of spot a bad person or you can identify a potential offender, and you can't really. But what you can do is train up your staff to recognise behaviours which do not fit with like the values of your organisation or your code of conduct. And if an organisation has really taken the time and effort to be totally clear about the values and the code of conduct and the expected standards of behaviour, and they're clearly communicated, it's then much easier for everyone to know when those are being transgressed in a minor way, perhaps at the start, but it's empowering for staff to be able to call out sort of behaviour that's contrary to values rather than identifying a problematic person. So it's a practical example, I would say, of the importance of values.
Yeah, no, that's, as you say, it's really insightful thinking about, those of you who employ organisations, think of your codes of conduct. Do they really live the values that you have as an organisation? So, Savita, in the work that you do, as in, as you say, you've worked with some governing bodies, you've worked with governing bodies and sport resolution. So, what would you want to build on about sort of culture and values? Why is it so important to organisations?
So I suppose building on my background in terms of actually being, working in safeguarding in child protection at an NGB, and for the last sort of 15 years really as well, it's really important in terms of values. the aspect that we see now in my work at Sport Resolutions is that it really has to be part and parcel of the DNA of your sport, making sure that safe sport is a golden thread running through. In terms of, I suppose, picking up on what you said about ensuring that there are key aspects and policies and procedures that pick up on low-level concerns. The White Review almost did highlight that if the policies and procedures are only as valuable as the people who are there to implement them. So the education piece that comes with that, and making sure that the workforce is educated and skilled to be able to deal with those elements, is really important as well. So that really feeds into the values of it's not just about having a policy or a procedure, and it's very much about how are we embedding this, how are we cascading this down, and really making sure that the volunteer workforce that you have is skilled. Because it's a bit like you said, the analogy also of the Apollo 13 matter that you were sort of looking back on. You know, the volunteers are what make up your sport. If you don't have volunteers, if you don't have participants, you don't have a sport. So it's really important that they're upskilled, they're brought along the journey with you, and that those values are led from top down, but also bottom up, and you're listening to them. I think from my experience, that's sometimes what's missed, is actually listening back. A lot of the reviews that you highlighted earlier, you know, that's a key piece to some of that as well, is listening to the participants in your sport and understanding exactly what it is that they want, how can things be improved, because they'll be the first to tell you what's missing, and they'll be the first to tell you where things, you know, are lacking. So it's really important that that's all sort of bedded in and sort of tied up.
Brilliant. Yeah. So there's probably a couple of things to draw out of, you know, both of those, you know, really insightful sort of pieces of information. So the first one, obviously, Savita's obviously said about, you know, running through the organisation, and again, you know, Christopher Quinlan QC, or I keep saying QC, it's KC now, remember, who obviously did the sort of work for UK Athletics. He talked around, when he talked about culture, and it's the same with values, he used the analogy of a stick of rock with the lettering, and it should go all the way through that stick of rock. So, you know, whether you're involved in the leadership in an organisation, down to your volunteers, if we think specifically of values, you know, do the people you work with understand, you know, do they get your values? And again, another one is that, and I was quite like analogies, I go and listen to conferences and write things down. So again, the Safe Sports Symposium about 3 weeks ago. So Li Lung, who has taken over as chief exec of USA Gymnastics, massive job that she had to take over. So one of the first things that she did is she looked at the mission of the organisation and rewrote the mission for US Gymnastics. And this is what it is now, is to build a community and culture of health, safety and excellence, whereby athletes can thrive in sport and life. So that is now the mission that USA Gymnastics has. And underpinning that, they have now 5 values, which are safety, integrity, accountability, transparency and listening. So often we talk about the culture of an organisation and people think, oh God, it's really hard to think about a culture. But actually, if you look at the values and the look of a mission statement of an organisation, that might be easy for you to think about how do you change that through your values. So you can really say this is, you know, and you heard obviously, you know, we talked about the values of Sport England this morning, about what values we have. You will all have values as an organisation. But what I would say to you is around safeguarding welfare integrity, can you see those within your values in the organisation? As Katie said, can you see, you know, the people that you recruit in your organisation really living those values when it comes to welfare and safety? So that's just a couple of, you know, analogies in terms of one of the things that's come out today about, you know, culture, values, how is it running through the organisation? So I'm going to obviously talk about leadership. Again, it's something that's come out today. Obviously, you know, we heard Mike this morning about leadership in sport. And again, interesting, he's talked around, you know, as in, you know, he talked initially about the nature of elite, you know, leadership in elite sport. But interesting, he talked about values-based leadership, you know, about changes needed in culture. And certainly we welcome the new code requirement of having a welfare and safety board champion. So just out of interest, raise of hands, as in how many of you have somebody on your board who is a named welfare and safety board champion? Okay, there's a few more people that have got a people plan, fantastic. So, and just out of interest, those people who have got, were they easy to recruit, or was it a bit of a who wants to do this job? I could do a bit of audience participation if I had a bit more time, because I'm really interested, as in, if anybody's would like to share with everybody about how they went around recruiting it. Was it a hard job? Was it a case of we need somebody who's going to do it, or have you looked at somebody with the right skills? Perhaps if we've got time at the end, I'm really interested in those of you who have somebody who's that board champion, and how you did it and what skills they have, because collectively, we all need to work together on this about how we solve it. But again, both of you, in the work that you do, as in, obviously, you probably come across sort of like, leaders at all levels. So, in terms of safeguarding integrity, what's the key thing that you would want the audience to take away?
I mean, I think from my perspective, at Sport Resolutions, we deal with, of course, arbitrations, mediations, investigations, and things like that. And I think what we see is when there is somebody who's key linked to safeguarding, they're very much driving the agenda. It's very much raising the awareness, raising the voice about it, raising key issues and so forth as well. So it's really important that from a leadership perspective, there is somebody that's helping to drive that agenda, making sure that there is an oversight on it as well. And linking back to your accountability point, naturally with safeguarding, there is such a key element of risk associated to it, not just reputational risk, but also from the optics of outside, it's trust. It's building that trust, so making sure that you have somebody who's key in continuing that message on, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a really positive step that there's this requirement in the new code to have to appoint the director to that sort of the lead role, the safeguarding role, because obviously I think organisations that embed a really strong safeguarding culture are ones in which there's an extremely clear message that safeguarding athletes is the top priority. Abusive behaviour won't be tolerated. Those who come forward with concerns will be supported and allegations will be investigated. And for that for that messaging to be effective, I think that messaging's got to come down from the board room level and kind of resonate down to all levels. And it's really effective, I think, to have somebody with a strong voice at board level, with an interest in and with a passion for kind of shaping that child-safe environment, and led by experts and collaborating with other organisations. I think a note of caution, though, in it, which is that it cannot and it should not mean that sort of takes away from the whole board's responsibility, because there's a couple of mantras which I'm sure you are familiar with and which we hear a lot, which is safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, and the mindset of it could happen here in our organisation, notwithstanding the safe processes we have. So I think sometimes if you've appointed somebody with the responsibility, there's maybe a temptation to just be like, well, they can worry about all that stuff and we can get on with the finance committee or whatever the other subcommittees people are on. So I think it's to be a slight caution that that doesn't happen. But undoubtedly, having that kind of conduit for passing information for down, and just a message it sends, I think, and a destigmatising of some of the issues which people lower down the organisation might find it hard to discuss or to be vocal about. If they know that there is somebody listening and also speaking up on those issues at board level, it makes it much easier to get traction at other levels of the organisation.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And, I'm sure both of you who've seen as in good leaders, whether that's at board level, chief exec level, obviously executive director level. So for the organisations that, in the room maybe who haven't identified a board champion, what skills do you think that they would need to be, obviously the welfare, noting your point, Katie, as in it isn't just to be one person, but what skills would they be looking for, to recruit somebody into that role?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I can't help but think about the education context here. I mean, because we do work with a lot of schools and school education businesses, and they obviously have a governing body of schools, and you will always have a safeguarding governor whose responsibility it is. And I know that schools find it difficult to recruit for those roles because it's a massive load of work and it's voluntary, obviously. But who the kind of people that I think do that role very successfully and of course would do it well in the sport context, I don't necessarily think you've got to have deep knowledge of the sport. I know this is controversial, but I do think sometimes being a little bit outside of the sport is a good thing. So you can ask probing questions. Well, why do we do that? What is the rationale for why that's the way that training is structured or whatever it is? Of course, I think an interest in the sport helps. I think just, you know, the ability to be that kind of critical friend voice, which is a difficult skill at board level because you're meant to be challenging in a supportive way. What other attributes? Loads of free time.
What's that? Free time.
Ironically, actually, I'm the safeguarding lead at my
there you go.
at my school, and I would absolutely wholeheartedly agree with what you said. I think actually you don't necessarily have to have, I didn't have any knowledge of education before I became a school governor, and I don't think you do have to have knowledge about the sport, but certainly being that critical friend, asking those critical questions, and also actually being open to receiving. Sometimes you have to have self-awareness that it is a difficult topic. People are really find it hard to ask. Is this a stupid question? Should I be asking this or should I not? So actually just being open and, you know, having an open door policy almost to say, it's no question is a silly question, come and ask, because that allows for the culture and the environment to harbour basically openness. So you can say, yeah, absolutely, we don't know the answer, but we'll find the answer. And it's almost that element of support that needs to be there as well with the leadership aspect. So in terms of skills, I'd definitely say being open, transparent, and yeah, having sort of, yeah, the critical sort of oversight over it.
Mm.
Yeah, I know that. And in terms of, you know, I mean, they're really, really good skills, but I know there's lots of organisations that have come to us and probably UK Sport and said, oh gosh, have you got a standard job description for this requirement? You know, and we are developing a suite of resources for organisations that, you know, we don't want you to wait for the resources and think, you know, we need them to come out and then we'll appoint. But if any of you, as in, want some support about, you know, job descriptions, how do we support each other with the role, what's the ongoing support for anybody that's, you know, leading that role on your board, then we're developing those resources to support you, as in the whole of the sector, because it's a really, really important role. But equally, as in, it is also about upskilling the rest of the board and also probably your senior management and the whole organisation. So I'm probably going to move on to a bit of a dry topic, but, you know, particularly we've talked about culture and obviously we've talked about, you know, compliance to culture, but there are still some things that we have to have, you know, about policies and procedures. And it's something that can come out in reviews, particularly, again, if you read the White Review, and was sort of it was quite critical about British gymnastics policies and procedures. So, but they're really important. You know, we have to have them in. We have to have policies and procedures that our participants need to understand. So, again, as in, you know, just talking about policies and procedures, I know, Savita, obviously you're really keen about policies and procedures and education. So, you know, what are the key things that, you know, organisations in the room and people joining remotely should think about when designing effective policies and procedures?
I mean, I think policies and procedures can be something that sounds a bit scary, but actually it's really not. Your policy is effectively your intent, your statement of intent, and then your procedure is how you bring that to life. It's the implementation of that policy. So it's really, they both go hand in hand. They both just need to be quite robust. Because what we see from sport resolutions perspective in terms of the independent person that's dealing with some of these appeals that are brought forward and things like that is when it's gone wrong, and actually when your policies and procedures don't allow for thorough investigations, thorough processes, ensuring people are held accountable, and sometimes that can obviously lead to appeals and that aspect of it, and that can get quite complicated and convoluted as well. So I think it's really important that to really think it through. What is it that we're trying to deliver here? How are we going to, you know, what's our statement about keeping children, young people and vulnerable groups safe? But actually, how are we going to do that with the resources that we have? Because of course, if everybody had an endless pot of money, we'd have everything that we wanted on our checklist, but that's not possible. So really thinking through how are we going to upskill the workforce? Because the policy is only as good as the education piece that you provide with it in terms of your regional welfare officers or your county development officers, whatever the setup is, but very much about the training that's provided, and then also thinking even further lower down to your volunteer workforce, which, as I said before, if you don't have a volunteer workforce, you don't have a sport. So very much thinking about the bespoke roles that people hold, whether that's the club welfare officer, the sort of umpire or whatever sort of refereeing roles that people might have. Club committee members as well are sometimes very much missed off, but they're such a key component to club culture and also county culture as well, because it all feeds off of one another. So really thinking through not just having the policy, the procedure, but the education piece that comes with it and the training that comes with it, because only if you have a skilled workforce will you have an effective workforce. And it goes almost back to what Trixie said earlier. I sort of make note again of an analogy. You can't speak the language if you can't speak the language, you can't start to make the difference, and that's very much it. If your volunteer workforce aren't feeling confident and skilled to deal with what is a very complex area, so safeguarding and child protection, they won't feel confident to be able to deliver on it. So it's really important that the policy, procedure, training and education piece all go hand in hand. Very much.
Fantastic. So Katie, I bet in the work that you come across lots of policies and procedures, as in...
You won't be surprised to hear that I love to see a well-written policy, but I see a vast variety of efforts. But I think some points I would draw out. One is brevity and subtraction. The value of subtraction in society, I think, is vastly underrated. We're always adding new ideas. No one ever goes to a business meeting and people talk about, let's not do this anymore. It's always like, just do this and this and this and more, and let's add this and this and this to the policy. It just becomes unworkable. So I really think that there's value in going back to a policy and seeing what can come out, what's been replaced, or and reduction, and trying to make it as tight as possible, because the reality is that it only gets read and properly used if it's short enough for that to happen. And I'm not averse to kind of having different versions of policy. And one thing I wanted to say is we've seen some governing bodies do some really cool things with child-friendly policies. Because you've got to think about who your stakeholders are for these policies. Who's actually accessing them? Is this for your staff? Is it for your volunteers? Do you think parents are meant to be understanding this policy? Is it for your actual young people that you're working with? And maybe you need different versions for those different audiences, or maybe you can actually come up with something that works for all of them. But I think, just to share an anecdote from my personal life, I've got sort of 3 pretty young children, and I remember they were learning in school, I've got twins, and they were learning about the UN rights of the child. And they just come home every day, like quoting this document at me. And I was, it was great because, actually this document had condensed in a very easy to use method, document for children, some really important concepts. And I thought that is so powerful to be able to do that. And perhaps organizations can do the same, where you are empowering the children that you're working with to be able to understand the policies that govern them. Maybe you wouldn't use that word because it's a bit sort of off-putting for children. But anyway, so I think child-friendly versions of policies can be really effective, but think about the stakeholders for them, reduce them, cut them, make them tighter.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And actually, I was going to talk about the rights of the child. You've actually, you've articulated it much better than I had. Because again, if we had time, we'd talk about the voices of children, young people, making sure that we're listening to them. The voices of people with lived experiences, as in, or some people call them survivors. I do a lot of work with people with lived experiences of abuse in sport, and some of them will say I don't like to be called a survivor because it implies that I've got over it, I live with it for the whole of my life, what the experience. So they, but I always ask them and say, how do I want you to want to be referred to? So they generally say people with lived experiences. But again, if you talk about policies and procedures and the voice of children, young people, have we got anybody from the RFU in the audience? No, if we haven't, as in, So they've developed it's a brilliant safeguarding poster that all their clubs are using based on the rights of the child.
Okay.
And it's about each of their children or the kids that go to the rugby sessions, what they can expect in terms of safeguarding. And it's so simple. It's written in children, young people speak. And again, it was built on the rights of the child. So just think about your policies, think about the audience, particularly children, young people. Do they understand that? So I said I'm sort of like going to try and keep to time. We are a couple of minutes over, but I'm interested whether anybody's got any specific questions. I'm going to hold it there because we probably could talk all day around this issue, and I'm sure people have got lots of questions. But obviously we have got one final session now. But again, if anybody's got any questions in the audience. Sorry, Craig, I threw you then, didn't I? Thinking I'm going to finish now, whether anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, no, I think your offer for me to forward questions to the panel is probably a good one, and that's what I'll do. I do have one that's come through on the app, and that is our recent safeguarding policy extends to nearly 20 documents, and clubs have complained that it is impenetrable. Katie, so this is just for you, Katie. Do you have examples of the tight policies that you would recommend? A tight policy.
No pressure, Katie.
I mean, yeah, look, I think there are lots of good templates and examples out there. I think the key thing with policies, though, is that they have to be bespoke. And I actually think some of the reason that clubs get into difficulties with sort of massive documents is because they haven't done the proper bespoking exercise. It's come from somewhere, it's up the peg. And when you go through, you can actually say, that's actually not particularly relevant for us, we'll remove that bit, whatever it is. But I mean, I'm sure your organisation offers support in this regard, policy writing, but also they don't have to be so complicated that you can't write them yourself. Actually think about what are you trying to achieve with a particular policy, and could you just have a go at doing it from scratch rather than getting something off the shelf that you think would be applicable, but actually is too cumbersome and too busy for your particular organisation.
Yeah. So just a couple of things to build on that. Katie's absolutely right, as in, the policies have got to be your own. Give us a template and then they just use that, but they have to be your own. But so a couple of pieces of work that we are doing is, again, the White Review, one of the recommendations that answered of British Gymnastics, so they had to look at their policies and procedures. So they are doing that, but recognising that is something that the whole sector can benefit from. Ourselves in UK Sport, we will be announcing our policy response to the White Review, hopefully before Christmas. But one of the things that we are committed to doing is probably not coming up with lots of sort of bespoke policies and templates, but more around the principles of good policies and procedures. So we are extending that piece of work that we will share with all of you that you can access about, if you're looking at policies, these are the principles that you need to think of. So it is a piece of work that we will be doing in response to the White Review.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And there's a question earlier, just a question from Jane about appointing a safeguarding and welfare lead. If the person who did have a successful or otherwise application process wants to stick that down in a blog for me, please, that would be nice, and then I can share that with the SGA community, and we can get a good success story out that way. But thank you, Jane. Thank you, Savita. Thank you, Katie. Really important topic, a really insightful discussion. Please, if you do have any questions, forward them to me. I'm pretty sure my contact details are readily available, so pass them on to me and we'll look at how we can formulate a response to you. But thank you to the panel.
Thank you.